Our chapter, Chapter 18, is about the Vietnam War and the people of the US's response to it. In the chapter, Howard Zinn talks about how the war was basically impossible for the US to win, because the majority of the Vietnam people supported the government and not the southern Vietnamese regime. The North Vietnamese army and the Viet Cong had a high morale because of this, while many US soldiers didn't want to be there in the first place, and were horrified by the things they were told to do, such as a massacre in My Lai, where hundreds of unarmed civilians were murdered. Many troops deserted. The chapter also talks about the Pentagon Papers that were released to the public and caused many people to protest. A myth that is addressed in this chapter is that mostly college students and intellectuals opposed the war, while the highest opposers to the war, statistically, were the lower class. Here is my first quote. This growing disaffection, accompanied as it will certainly be by increased defiance of the draft and growing unrest in the cities because of the belief that we are neglecting domestic problems, runs great risk of provoking a domestic crisis of unprecedented proportions. This quote talks about the government's refusal to end the war and the effects it will have in the states. That if they don't end it, more and more people refuse upon being drafted, and how the protests in the cities regarding the war and how it is causing problems here to grow more serious, that there's a potential for something really crazy and bad happening here in the States. Here's my second quote. Communist control of all the Southeast Asia would render the U.S. position in the Pacific offshore island chain precarious and would seriously jeopardize fundamental U.S. security interests in the Far East. This quote talks about the domino effect that the U.S. feared would happen if one country was allowed to have communism. The U.S. was afraid that if all the southeastern islands of Asia became communist, then not only would there be security issues, but the islands were also really good sources of raw materials that nobody would have access to via trade if they became self-sufficient communist countries.